On June 22, 1941, a German mechanized column was moving along a road in the Baltic region. Suddenly, a heavy Soviet tank appeared in their path. The commander of a German Panzer III ordered his crew to open fire, but the 37mm shells struck the target without penetrating its armor, failing to inflict any significant damage. The German crews realized their guns were ineffective against this target. In the ensuing firefight, the Soviet tank returned fire, knocking out the German vehicles one by one. This tank was the KV-1, named after the People's Commissar of Defense, Kliment Voroshilov. In the initial phase of the conflict, this model posed a serious problem for the Wehrmacht forces due to its high level of protection. The story of the KV-1 began in the late 1930s. The Soviet military leadership saw the need for heavy armor designed to break through fortified defense lines and engage enemy forces. The design was entrusted to a Leningrad design bureau led by Joseph Kotin. By the end of 1939, prototypes were already undergoing testing, demonstrating superior tactical and technical performance. Weighing in at 52.4 tons with 3 inches of frontal armor, this tank was shielded from the mass-produced anti-tank fire of the period. Its side armor reached 2.4 inches, providing protection against German tank guns from 1939. The issue of the main armament was tackled in stages. The first KV-1 models were equipped with a 76mm L11 cannon, which was seen as a temporary measure. By the spring of 1940, it was replaced by the F-32, though even this version didn't fully meet technical requirements. The 76mm caliber was chosen with the realities of the late 30s in mind, when that kind of power was enough to take out any existing armored vehicles. German Panzer IIIs had 1.2 inches of frontal armor, Panzer IVs had 1.4, and the French Char B1s had 2.4. The Soviet gun could punch through their defenses from a distance of up to 0.6 miles. Nevertheless, Command was looking ahead at options for modernization. In the summer of 1940, following the end of the French campaign, work began in the USSR on a new gun. Engineers utilized the ballistics of the 3K anti-aircraft gun, which actually traced its design back to German developments, and used it to create a powerful tank weapon. From 0.6 miles away, the new system could penetrate 2.4 inches of armor, and from 550 yards, it could go through 3 inches. The gun was designated the ZIS-5 and was intended to boost the combat effectiveness of the KV-1. Installation began in October 1941, with fighting already underway, even though previous models could handle enemy armor from the early part of the war. Auxiliary armament included 3 7.62mm DT machine guns. One was mounted coaxially with a cannon, the second was placed in the front hull plate, and a third was installed in the rear of the turret for defense against infantry. The heavy tank's crew consisted of 5 men: a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator. Conditions inside were cramped, loud, and incredibly hot, especially during the summer. But despite the poor ergonomics, the design provided a high level of protection. By the time active combat began, the fleet included about 600 KV-1s of various models. At that time, in terms of overall performance, these machines were superior to anything the enemy and their allies had. When the offensive launched on June 22nd, German troops ran into these tanks, and it came as a complete surprise to the Wehrmacht command. Gunners and tank crews, who had previously successfully taken out light tanks like the BT and T-26, found that their weapons were ineffective against these new heavy machines. The standard 37mm anti-tank guns, the PAK-35 and PAK-36, proved practically useless against this type of armor. Shells often just ricocheted off without causing significant damage. The 50mm PAK-38 guns also couldn't guarantee a penetration through the KV-1's front armor. German tank guns, in both 37 and 50mm, showed the same lack of effectiveness. There is a famous historical episode in Lithuania where a single KV-1 tank blocked the advance of a large enemy formation. Taking up a position on a narrow stretch of road, the crew stopped the column from moving. To neutralize the tank, they used various tactical methods, including artillery fire and air support. The only effective solution turned out to be the 88mm anti-aircraft guns, which had enough power to penetrate the heavy tank's armor. There is a well-known case where a single KV-1 held off the enemy for several days, destroying a significant amount of equipment and artillery before finally being taken out of action. In the summer and fall of 1941, the crews of these heavy tanks held a major tactical advantage. Their thick armor allowed them to close in on German positions and effectively suppress strongpoints and enemy armor. Enemy shells often failed to penetrate, leaving only external damage. According to eyewitness accounts, after a battle, dozens of impact marks could be counted on the hull and turret, yet the tank remained combat-capable. This high level of protection created a psychological effect. The crews trusted the machine's survivability, while the opposing side faced the reality that their weapons were simply not effective enough. However, operating the KV-1 came with technical difficulties. The key flaw, revealed once mass use began, was the poor reliability of the transmission. Originally, the tank's design weight was 44 tons, but the first production models in 1939 already weighed 47.4 tons, and by 1941 that figure had risen to 52.4 tons. The situation was made worse by manufacturing factors. The industry at the time could not always ensure consistent casting parameters, which caused the weight of the machines to vary. By the fall of 1941, the mass of individual tanks reached as high as 55 tons. The transmission components, specifically the gearbox and steering clutches, were designed for a lighter load and failed systematically. Breakdowns often occurred on the march, before the tanks even entered combat. Field repairs by the drivers were often impossible, requiring the equipment to be sent to rear workshops. Evacuating a 55-ton machine during a retreat was an extremely difficult task. As a result, a significant number of KV-1s were abandoned not due to battle damage, but because of unfixable technical failures. The Wehrmacht repaired and used captured Soviet heavy tanks, prizing them for their high resistance to standard anti-tank weapons. In the spring of 1941, before active combat had even begun, Soviet command decided to reinforce the KV-1 with additional armor plating. Extra plates, 1 and 1.4 inches thick, were mounted on the front of the hull and turret, as well as the sides. The goal of this upgrade was to make the machine completely invulnerable. In theory, increasing the frontal armor to over 4 inches made the tank immune to the German arsenal of the early war period. However, in practice, these changes brought technical complications. The weight of the up-armored KV-1's approached 66 tons, and the transmission simply couldn't handle the increased load. Numerous mechanical breakdowns plagued operation. Steering clutches failed, shafts snapped, and crankcases cracked. The vehicles were often immobilized even over short distances. The massive weight put a critical strain on bridges and roads, while off-road performance dropped significantly. Crews complained about how hard the tanks were to operate, and reports from the front line pointed to the low combat effectiveness of these modifications. Production of tanks with the additional protection continued until the end of July 1941. Eventually, field experience showed that the extra armor had to be abandoned. In July 1942, the results of the experiment were officially deemed unsatisfactory. Development began on a lighter version, the KV-1's, standing for high speed, where armor thickness was reduced to bring the total weight down to acceptable levels. Reducing the tank's weight and improving its reliability were achieved just as the tactical situation on the front lines shifted. In the fall of 1941, Soviet command decided to upgrade the KV-1's firepower, deeming the performance of the L-11 and F-32 guns insufficient. In October, installation began on the new ZIS-5 cannon, a weapon developed using anti-aircraft ballistics. This system offered superior armor penetration and greater range. Introducing the ZIS-5 fixed a technical imbalance, where the heavy tank actually lagged behind the medium T-34 in firepower, which had been equipped with the F-34 gun since March 1941. Finally, the heavy tank's armament was brought in line with its class. During the winter of 1941 and 42, these upgraded machines saw combat on the Moscow and Leningrad fronts. The KV-1 remained a difficult target for German forces. Its armor could withstand hits from most standard anti-tank weapons, while the updated gun allowed it to destroy enemy vehicles. KV-1 units were deployed in the counteroffensive near Moscow, tasked with breaking through defenses and supporting the infantry. Lacking mass-produced specialized weapons to fight Soviet heavy tanks, the Wehrmacht was forced to use 88mm anti-aircraft guns. At the same time, German engineers and military personnel analyzed captured vehicles to identify weak points and develop effective countermeasures. Captured models were fired upon at proving grounds to study their armor resistance and design features. Based on this data, they concluded that a rapid modernization of their anti-tank weaponry was essential. At the same time, work was underway to strengthen the armor on German tanks. The Panzer III started getting additional frontal protection of up to 2 inches, with some specific models reaching a thickness of 2.75 inches. The Panzer IV also received reinforced frontal armor of up to 2 inches. In the spring and summer of 1942, the situation changed as German industry ramped up mass production of the new 75mm PA-K-40 anti-tank gun. The introduction of this weapon was a major factor in the evolution of firepower. The PA-K-40 could penetrate the KV-1's armor at effective combat ranges. It could strike not just the sides or the rear, but under the right conditions, it could punch right through the front. These guns began arriving to the troops in significant numbers, used in towed configurations as well as on self-propelled guns and tanks. For KV-1 crews, this meant the loss of their previous level of protection. The ability to safely close in on enemy positions vanished, and the risk of the vehicle being destroyed upon entering the battlefield increased substantially. Enemy artillery crews adapted to dealing with the KV-1, concentrating their fire on its vulnerable zones, the armor joints, the turret, and the sides. Losses among Soviet heavy tanks rose noticeably. Vehicles that were previously considered hard to hit were now being knocked out by standard anti-tank weapons, effectively nullifying their former advantage in armor. At the same time, the Germans continued to upgrade the protection on their own vehicles. By the summer of 1942, Panzer IV tanks with 3.15-inch frontal armor began appearing at the front. Theoretically, the Soviet ZIS-5 gun had the specs to take out such a target. According to the documentation, it had an armor penetration of 3.3 inches at a range of 550 yards. However, practical tests on the proving grounds showed a discrepancy with the calculations. The shells failed to penetrate the 3.15-inch German armor, leaving dents only about 1.8 inches deep. It is worth noting that the durability of frontal armor depends on a complex set of factors and isn't just a uniform figure. The presence of weak spots, hatches, and vision ports allowed an experienced gunner to find vulnerabilities, since the Panzer IV's turret had 2-inch armor and could still be penetrated. However, combat conditions had become much more difficult. A tactical situation developed where, in a head-on clash at 760 yards, a Soviet KV-1 heavy tank could have its hull or turret penetrated by fire from a German Panzer IV medium tank. At the same time, the Panzer IV's 3.15-inch frontal armor provided protection against the KV-1's gun. Thus, the German medium tank had gained the advantage over the Soviet heavy tank. This led to a substantial drop in the combat effectiveness of the KV-1, which came to be seen as an unreliable and vulnerable machine. By the end of the summer of 1942, the need for an urgent, deep modernization of the KV-1 was recognized. It required a simultaneous strengthening of both armor and weaponry. But to implement these measures, the problem of excessive weight had to be solved first. The up-armoring proved inefficient because tanks with that extra protection lost their mobility. The solution chosen was to radically lighten the design by reducing armor thickness and removing unnecessary parts. This began the development of the KV-1's, a lightened version of the heavy tank. In July 1942, Command recognized that the up-armored machines were ill-suited for combat, which matched the crew's own experience. They began dismantling the additional armor to restore driving performance and mechanical reliability. Even so, removing the plates didn't solve every problem. The basic KV-1 was still too heavy for its transmission, leading to frequent breakdowns and the need for repairs. The designers were tasked with creating a modernized version of the tank, one with less weight, higher speed, and better reliability. The modernization process was pushed through at a rapid pace. Engineers reworked the design to cut as much weight as possible. Frontal armor thickness was reduced from 3 inches to 2.4 inches, and side armor from 2.4 to 2 inches. The turret size and weight were also trimmed down. A new gearbox was installed, and the suspension was reinforced. This variant was designated the KV-1's, standing for high speed. By the end of the summer, mass production of the updated machines had begun. Dropping the weight to 46 tons, down from the previous 55, made a real difference in operation. The transmission was more stable, allowing the tanks to complete long marches without breaking down. But lightening the design had its consequences. The reduction in armor protection coincided with the German troops getting flooded with new anti-tank weapons. The modernized tank lost the invincibility that defined the 1941 model. PAK-40 guns could now effectively penetrate its armor at longer ranges. Crews got a more reliable and maneuverable machine, but one that had lost the key advantage of a heavy tank, the ability to take a hit. In effect, the KV-1's had acquired protection levels closer to those of medium tanks, yet it kept its significant weight and size. In the fall of 1942, the situation got worse with the arrival of a new German heavy tank on the Eastern Front, the Tiger. Weighing in at 63 tons, this machine was armed with an 88mm gun and boasted 4 inches of frontal armor. This allowed it to fire on the KV-1 from a distance of 1 to 1.2 miles, while staying well out of range of return fire. The ZIS-5 gun was useless against the German tank's frontal armor. The target could only be destroyed by hitting the side or rear from close range. Soviet tankers found themselves facing an enemy with technical superiority. There is a common belief that the arrival of the Tigers was the main reason the KV-1 was taken out of production, but that's not entirely accurate. Tiger tanks were too few in number to be used more than sporadically, so they didn't have a decisive impact on the overall strategic situation. A far more significant factor was the mass-produced PAK-40 guns available to the enemy in large numbers. These systems were everywhere, mounted on self-propelled guns and tanks alike. It was this widespread use of the 75mm caliber, rather than the rare heavy machines, that made the KV-1 a vulnerable target. The medium T-34 could also be penetrated by these guns, yet its production continued. The decision to take the KV-1 out of production was dictated by the very concept of the heavy tank. Such a vehicle must hold an advantage over medium tanks in both protection and firepower. The KV-1's variant lost its necessary durability due to reduced armor, while the ZIS-5 gun proved too weak to counter new enemy armor. At the same time, it retained all the operational drawbacks of the heavy class: massive weight, high cost, and difficulty of repair. A situation arose where significant industrial resources were being spent on a machine whose combat effectiveness didn't significantly exceed, and in some ways was inferior to, the medium T-34. Due to component reliability issues, designers concluded that the weaponry needed to be strengthened. Since the 76mm caliber had reached its limit for modernization, a move to larger systems was required. But this created technical contradictions. A more powerful gun meant a heavier turret and the need to reinforce the entire structure. The tank's weight would inevitably increase, even though they had shortly before managed to lower it to 46 tons by reducing the armor. A vicious circle emerged. Strengthening the weaponry led to increased weight, which demanded a tougher transmission, something that was already difficult to produce even for the existing loads. At the end of 1942, production of the base model KV-1 was stopped. Production of the KV-1's modification continued for a while, but these machines were viewed only as a temporary solution until new equipment arrived. Military leadership initiated the development of a fundamentally new heavy tank, capable of eliminating the KV-1's flaws and countering the German heavy Tiger tanks. This project became the IS series. By 1943, the remaining KV-1's were operating in a significantly more difficult tactical environment. Machines that once held the advantage on the battlefield had lost their dominant position. Their armor no longer guaranteed safety, their weaponry was inferior to the new German models, and mechanical unreliability limited their combat potential. Despite the equipment being obsolete, it was still used. KV-1 crews fought in battles at the Kursk Bulge and in the territories of Ukraine and Belarus, striving to compensate for the technical lag by applying appropriate tactical solutions. Crew commanders adapted their battle tactics to match the technical specs of their machines, weighing both their strengths and their flaws. The firepower of the KV-1 allowed it to effectively strike German armor in the sides and rear, so priority was given to stealthy maneuvering and flanking attacks. Although vulnerable to PAK-40 guns from the front, the tank's armor still offered protection against shrapnel and small arms fire, increasing the crew's chances of survival. Head-on clashes were often replaced by ambush tactics and the use of natural terrain features. German units also made active use of captured KV-1's. This was because Soviet 45 and 76mm anti-tank guns were largely ineffective against the armor on these tanks. For Red Army forces, encounters with these captured machines posed a significant threat. Destroying them required a major effort, while the crew of the captured tank could return effective fire against artillery positions and infantry. The Wehrmacht implemented special instructions for operating captured Soviet heavy tanks. Crews were trained and logistical support was organized. By the middle of 1943, most of the KV-1 fleet had been lost in combat or taken out of service due to technical reasons. Repair crews faced a shortage of spare parts and a lack of qualified mechanics to maintain the machines. A significant number of tanks had to be written off, not because of battle damage, but due to critical wear and tear on the transmission, engines, and suspension. Broken-down units were often stripped for parts to repair the remaining equipment. Over time, the KV-1's were replaced in tank units by the new IS series heavy tanks and the mass production of the T-34. Nevertheless, the operation of the KV-1 played its role in the conflict, and labeling this machine as ineffective would not fit the historical context of its use. Despite existing technical flaws, this model played a substantial role in the evolution of Soviet tank building. Thanks to the KV-1 project, heavy tank production was established even before the war. This allowed design bureaus to gain necessary experience and the industry to form a manufacturing base for producing complex machinery. The accumulated expertise and infrastructure facilitated the rapid development and launch of the IS tanks, whose characteristics were comparable to the German Tigers and Panthers. Furthermore, the KV-1 chassis served as a platform for a family of self-propelled artillery units. Based on this heavy tank, the Su-152 and Su-122 were developed, equipped with 152 and 122mm guns. These machines demonstrated effectiveness both in countering enemy armor and in destroying fortifications. Using the chassis of the T-34 medium tank to mount such heavy weaponry had objective limitations. Attempts to build heavy self-propelled guns on this platform came with design challenges. Mounting a 122mm gun on the T-34 revealed operational flaws caused by the massive recoil, which created risks for the crew. On the Su-100 model, Cracks were found in the front armor, and weld seams warped under the strain of the long-barreled gun. Unlike the medium platform, the chassis of the heavy KV and IS tank series were tough enough to carry large-caliber artillery systems. The design could withstand the dynamic loads during firing, staying intact and allowing the crew to operate. With no 76mm gun capable of effectively penetrating heavy German armor, engineers decided to move in a new direction, increasing the caliber of the weaponry. Mounting large-caliber guns required a suitable platform, a role filled by heavy tanks and the self-propelled guns based on them. Using the KV-1 chassis ensured that frontline units had machines capable of effectively taking on enemy armor. The main force of KV-1s was phased out of active service by the end of 1943. Later on, individual tanks continued to be used in training units, on secondary sectors of the front, or as fixed gun emplacements on defensive lines. The model's active service life had come to an end. The tank had done its job, providing valuable experience in operating heavy armor and refining the manufacturing technologies needed to design more modern machines. Despite its design flaws, the KV-1 platform served as the technological foundation for the IS series and heavy self-propelled artillery, becoming a pivotal stage in the development of armored forces that directly impacted the outcome of the war against the Wehrmacht.